We've covered quite a few Charlie Brown specials over the years here on TV Trash, and throughout the good and the bad from them, you might have noticed that many of them did have something in common. In most Peanuts animated productions, even the good ones and the movies, a lot of the material was flat out lifted from the comics. There's almost no deviation at all. It's word for word everything that was printed in the newspapers. And by the end of the 70s, as the demand for more Charlie Brown animation began to grow, it looks like Charles Schulz decided to just completely transfer his more memorable storylines from the strips over to TV format, rather than try to craft a supposedly separate story around them. The 23rd and 25th specials, A Charlie Brown Celebration and It's an Adventure Charlie Brown, were both hour-long compilations of shorts that were completely adapted from storylines that came from the comics. And for what it's worth, CBS must have been impressed with that format, as it led to them giving Schulz a time slot on Saturday mornings. And thus, in 1983, Charlie Brown and the Peanuts gang finally hit it big in animation with the Charlie Brown and Snoopy Show. Like Saturday Super Kate and the Berenstain Bears, this was one of the first Saturday morning shows that drew my interest into television. For 3 years, the Peanuts gang was the anchor of CBS's Saturday morning lineup, allowing us to see those beloved characters each week, rather than having to wait for the next time prime time would be preempted. So yes, the first season featured 13 shows whose episodes were pretty much taken straight from the strips. Because of that, the episodes themselves varied on length of time, even as they compiled independent strips to form one cohesive theme. So we would occasionally get one short episode of Sally making a fool of herself in school, and then a different one of Peppermint Patty making a fool of herself in school.
The answer is 12. It isn't? How about 6? 4? 9? 2? 10? Do you have the feeling that I'm guessing?
With the lights on in here, and the rain and darkness outside, there's sort of a medieval atmosphere. No, ma'am, I don't know what the capital of Norway is.
The ironic thing is, nowadays, they'd probably be the only 2 kids who could understand Common Core. Trust me, there were other themes, like the constant battle between Linus and Lucy over Linus's dependence on his blanket, or Lucy constantly badgering Schroeder with her amorous advances.
Schroeder, do you think a pretty girl is like a melody?
I can't say. I've never known any pretty girls.
May your stupid piano be devoured by termites.
See, Peanuts was equal opportunity like that. In this world, it's the girls who couldn't take a hint that he's just not that into ya. Of course, there were a lot of baseball-themed episodes almost once a show, and this makes sense because that's where a lot of the memorable storylines were. And yes, they usually center around how Chuck and his team are going to find a way to lose their next game, often at the expense of Patty's team.
We slaughter you twice in April, smash you 3 times in May, and ruin you once in June. We murder you twice in July, annihilate you 3 times in August, and pound you once in September.
So yeah, basically it's what the Chicago Cubs endure every year. And the Rangers, shut up! Probably the cruelest version of this was when they managed to actually win a game thanks to Linus's baby brother Rerun, only to have the league take away the win when it was revealed Rerun bet on the game.
I only bet a nickel. What else can you do with a nickel these days?
Of course. I must admit one thing. You're the first person who ever had the courage to bet on Charlie Brown's team.
I'll drink to that.
Wait, so this was one of the series where Chuck's team did play in a league? Yeah, Peanuts was about as loose with continuity as a 1960s sitcom. There's not much more to say about these episodes. It's Charlie Brown and Friends exactly the way you'd expect them to be. The exact same humor and charm that you saw in the comic panels. So, if this was what we should have expected from a Peanuts TV series, why didn't it last longer than it did? Well, the big reason probably is they just ran out of ideas. The strip had been around for decades when the series came out, but given what they had already adapted for the first season and the specials that preceded it, it is possible there likely weren't that many storylines from the comics left to create good episodes for. The first season was repeated for the 84-85 year, then only 5 new shows were made for the fall of 1985, and a lot of them seem to include episodes that were more original with storylines not taken directly from the strips. And you know, that might have actually helped keep the show going longer had they stuck with those newer stories. That's pretty much how Garfield and Friends remained on the air for 7 years, airing all episodes that were completely new stories. But it looks like for one reason or another, they just weren't able to produce them. Also, the new episodes definitely had a different tone to them. Most of them abandoned the more traditional format of Charlie Brown and Friends' struggles with their everyday lives and often took a more fantastical approach. Like this one where Snoopy and Woodstock basically find themselves in Jack and the Beanstalk. Or when Snoopy learns how to make himself disappear like the Cheshire Cat. But probably my favorite of those is when everyone goes to computer camp. And yes, all you youngins, computers were that big back then.
With this one, you can make your own computer game.
One of these 3 entrances to the cave is the right one. But I have to warn you, there's a very mean person guarding the gold.
3 guesses as to who the mean person looks like. And the first 2 don't count.
So you think that's funny?
These computer games can sometimes be dangerous.
And yet that game was probably still more entertaining than half the crap on Steam right now. The title sequence also endured its own change for this second season, as the theme music had lyrics added to it that were naturally performed by the vocal goddess that was Desiree Goyette. These vocals were actually originally created for release on the Flash Beagle album that was made in conjunction with that Peanuts special. Actually, the more I think about it, the difference between these 2 seasons is really indicative of how the strip changed over the years. I've pointed out before how Charlie Brown and his failures were all reflective of Charles Schulz's own issues of self-doubt. Well, as the years went on and he began to see how good of a life he really had, having since found himself with a happy marriage and family in addition to the success of his franchise, the Peanuts stories in both print and video began to change into more of a whimsical tone, and these later episodes of the show really do demonstrate that. It appears this change in tone did disappoint some people. It's not that the new material was bad, it just wasn't the Peanuts they were used to. Does that mean I'm bashing the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show? Not necessarily. I mean, maybe it just wasn't possible for this show at that time to keep going with newer stories. One reason Garfield was able to produce 7 years of fresh material was that Jim Davis pretty much let Mark Evanier run free with his own writing. And Evanier used that to take out his frustrations of having dealt with restrictive bullcrap for years to create some pretty intelligent social commentary for the time. And that made for a lot of possibilities that could be made into stories for several years. I don't know if that would have worked with Charlie Brown. Garfield appealed to the cynic in us, with made critique on social issues come naturally, while Peanuts has always seemed to convey a more innocent time. Also, it looks like Schulz was much more hands-on and didn't want to leave his characters in the hands of other people writing stories, but he also just couldn't put in the time to regularly write enough content for a full season worth of television, especially when it became clear he'd need new fresh material instead of just repackaging what he'd already created. But to be honest, even that repackaged material really worked. As I looked back at these episodes and the specials that inspired them, they were actually the most entertaining Peanuts cartoons that I remembered. One big reason may be that the episodes weren't just about Charlie Brown. They actually were really diverse in the characters each one focused on. We got to see comedy adventures from Peppermint Patty and Marcy, Linus and Lucy, Sally, of course Snoopy and Woodstock. There was plenty material for every character to go around. And that was where the episodic format of a series really lent to this possibility. So, maybe overall, the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show was just a brief burst of light that wasn't destined to last, but was worth it to see it when it happened. We often like to complain on the internet when TV shows get the short end of the stick and get canceled way too early for our tastes. But sometimes it is nice to look back on a show and know that it didn't last too long and the characters and stories never ended up getting stale or past their prime. If a briefly lasting series was what was needed to keep Peanuts cartoons as true to the source material, then so be it. And we should be glad that we got what we did. And thanks to it being available through iTunes and the Warner Archive collection, we can still relive its memories. And that's something that throughout the years, we've really been lucky about concerning the Peanuts franchise. We've seen other stuff get changed by either a new creator's attempt to put his own stamp on it or some idea that it needs to be made more trendy. But Charlie Brown has never had to deal with that. Throughout the good and the bad of it all, Charles Schulz's vision of his characters have remained true, which is something we don't get to say about a lot of other nostalgic franchises. We know what we want to see from Charlie Brown, Linus, Lucy, Peppermint Patty, and Snoopy, and we've always gotten it. From A Charlie Brown Christmas, to the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show, to especially this most recent Peanuts movie. It's been a legacy that's remained by staying true to itself, and it's why we're always glad to see it come back. Maybe that's why people love to see my Charlie Brown reviews so much, because they're about something that has always touched a soft spot in each and every one of us.